David Miller stood outside the diner long before sunrise, the cold Seattle air settling into his jacket as he stared at the faded sign above the door. The paint was chipped, the neon barely working, and the windows carried the dull haze of years without care. To anyone else, it looked like a place at the end of its story. To David, it felt like the only place where a new one could begin. He tightened his grip on the keys in his hand, thinking briefly of the office he once walked into every morning, clean, polished, predictable. That life had ended with a short meeting and a quiet dismissal, leaving him with nothing but responsibility and a daughter who depended on him. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the faint smell of old grease and dust greeting him. The silence was heavy, almost uncertain, as if the diner itself wasn't sure it could come back to life. David flicked on the lights one by one, watching the space slowly reveal itself: cracked leather booths, a worn counter, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used properly in years. It was overwhelming, but he didn't allow himself to step back. Instead, he set his bag down, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. Cleaning came first. Hours passed as he wiped down surfaces, scrubbed floors, and cleared out what couldn't be saved. Every small improvement felt like progress, even when exhaustion crept into his arms. By the time the sun began to rise, faint light filtered through the windows, catching the dust he had stirred into the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been the night before. That was enough. In the corner booth, his daughter sat quietly with her backpack, pulling out her books as she always did. She didn't complain about the early mornings or the long days. Instead, she watched him with a kind of quiet belief that gave him strength. Every now and then, she would smile, and that alone reminded him why he couldn't afford to fail. When the diner officially opened that morning, there was no rush of customers, no sudden change in fortune. Just a single man walking in, looking around with mild curiosity before taking a seat. David greeted him with a calm, steady voice, as if this place had always been running smoothly. He prepared the meal carefully, focusing on getting every detail right. When the customer left, he offered a simple, "Thank you," and a nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. As the day moved on, a few more people trickled in. Some stayed longer than expected, drawn not by the diner's appearance, but by the effort behind it. David kept moving, cooking, serving, cleaning, never stopping long enough to think about how far he still had to go. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was one he was building with his own hands. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, that felt like enough to keep going. The bell above the diner door rang softly as the man stepped inside, bringing with him the damp chill of the Seattle rain. He paused just long enough to shake the water from his coat before scanning the room with a detached, almost automatic glance. To him, it was just another roadside stop, nothing remarkable, nothing memorable. But to David, standing behind the counter with a dish towel in his hand, the moment stretched longer than it should have. Recognition came instantly, sharp and undeniable. It was the same man who had once sat across from him in a glass office, delivering a decision that had changed everything in a matter of minutes. For a brief second, David felt the past press against the present. The memory of that day, of being dismissed, of walking out with his future suddenly uncertain, rose to the surface. But just as quickly, he let it settle. This wasn't that place, and he wasn't that man anymore. He set the towel aside, straightened his posture, and stepped forward with quiet confidence. "Welcome," he said, his tone steady, professional, as though greeting any other customer. The man gave a small nod, already halfway to a booth near the window. He didn't look closely at David, not yet. He slid into the seat, picked up the menu, and began scanning it without urgency. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping against the glass in a soft, steady rhythm. Inside, the diner felt calm, grounded, far removed from the sharp edges of corporate life. David approached the table with a notepad in hand, waiting patiently until the man looked up. When their eyes met, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of familiarity, like trying to place a face in a different context. David didn't rush the moment or fill the silence. He simply stood there, composed, giving the man time to recognize what he was seeing. "I'll have the eggs and coffee," the man said finally, his voice neutral, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than before. "Of course," David replied, jotting it down before turning toward the kitchen. As he moved behind the counter, the routine took over. The sound of eggs hitting the griddle, the low hum of the coffee machine, the familiar rhythm of preparing a simple meal, it all grounded him. There was something steady about it, something honest. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. He was just doing the work, the same way he had every day since the diner became his responsibility. When he returned with the plate, everything was prepared with care. The eggs were cooked just right, the toast evenly browned, the coffee fresh. He placed it in front of the man without hesitation. This time, the recognition came fully. "David," the man said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he didn't bother to hide. David met his eyes calmly. "Yes," he answered, nothing more. There was a pause, the kind that fills a room without needing words. The man leaned back slightly, studying him now with a different kind of attention. This wasn't the same setting, and the difference was impossible to ignore. The polished office, the controlled environment, the clear hierarchy, all of that was gone. Here, things felt more equal, more real. "I didn't expect to see you here," the man admitted, glancing briefly around the diner before returning his gaze to David. "I didn't expect to be here," David replied, his tone even, not defensive or bitter, just honest. The man nodded slowly, as if absorbing that. He picked up his fork and took a bite, though his focus seemed divided between the meal and the conversation forming in his mind. After a moment, he spoke again. "You own this place?" "Yes." The answer was simple, but it carried weight. There was no hesitation in it, no need for explanation. It was a fact David had earned through long days and difficult choices. The man looked around again, this time more carefully. The diner wasn't perfect. There were still signs of its age, its struggles, but there was something else there too. A sense of effort, of intention. It wasn't just a business, it was something being rebuilt, piece by piece. "It's different," the man said, though it was clear he hadn't found the exact word he was looking for. David allowed himself a small nod. "It is." For a while, the conversation paused as the man focused on his meal. But the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful, like something was shifting beneath the surface. When he finally set his fork down, his expression had softened, the sharpness from earlier replaced by something more reflective. "You always had good instincts," he said, almost as if speaking to himself as much as to David. "I can see that hasn't changed." David didn't respond immediately. Compliments, especially from this man, didn't carry the same weight they once might have. Still, he acknowledged it with a quiet, "Thank you." Another pause followed, longer this time. Then the man leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Have you thought about expanding this?" he asked. The question caught the air differently. It wasn't casual curiosity, it carried the beginnings of something more. David considered it for a moment before answering. "I've thought about a lot of things," he said carefully. The man nodded, as if expecting that. "Places like this, real places, they're rare. There's potential here, more than you might think." David listened, but he didn't react right away. He had learned not to rush decisions, not to let someone else define what came next. That was a lesson this very man had unintentionally taught him. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, steady. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not in a hurry." The response seemed to surprise the man slightly, but not in a negative way. If anything, it made him reconsider his approach. He gave a small, understanding nod. "That's fair." When the meal was finished, the man reached for his wallet and placed the payment on the table, along with something extra. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the shift in the air, the quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken. As he stood to leave, he hesitated for a brief moment, looking at David with a different kind of respect than before. Not the kind that came from titles or positions, but the kind that came from recognizing resilience. "Good to see you, David," he said. David nodded once. "You too." The bell rang again as the door opened, letting in the sound of rain before closing behind him. The diner returned to its steady rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but something beneath it had settled into place. David picked up the empty plate and carried it back to the kitchen, his movements calm and deliberate. Whatever opportunities came next, whatever decisions he would face, one thing was certain. This time, the choice would be his.